little time goes by and he's like, hey, you, this is me. Yeah, so about those hellfires, tell me again where you are. Well, I'm in Virginia, about 7,000 miles away, but the aircraft's sitting right over top of you, and I'm pretty comfortable I can put that hellfire wherever you need it. And he's like, you're going to pull the trigger on a hellfire from 7,000 miles away, danger close on me? I don't think so. He goes, I'll tell you what. He goes, I'm going to give you a target down the hill. I'm going to walk you onto this bush. You hit the bush, and then I'll have confidence.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served Warzone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today we hear a combat story detailing the almost startup-like creation and expansion of the CIA and military's drone program that would go on to help find, fix, and finish high-value targets across the globe with Army veteran and CIA officer Alec Bierbauer. Alec was an Army intel soldier and warrant officer before being handpicked to join D.I.A. and then being handpicked yet again, this time by CIA legend Cofer Black, to join the agency. Prior to 9/11, Alec was detailed from D.I.A. to CIA's virtual station, coincidentally named Alec Station, tracking Al-Qaida and Bin Laden. He would later have the opportunity to fire some of the first shots of the war against AQ through the Predator program. He went on to be a CIA chief of base in the early years of the global war on terror to track down targets in Afghanistan, and continued serving in austere environments, including several stints more recently in an expeditionary capacity in locations he can't name while in more senior roles at the agency. Alec and Mark Cooter wrote the book Never Mind, We'll Do It Ourselves, the inside story of how a team of renegades broke rules, shattered barriers, and launched a drone warfare revolution, which details never before seen or heard experiences of how the drone program was stood up and leveraged post 9/11. This interview was a blast, and I hope you enjoy this detailed look at such a critical program to national security during such a pivotal time as much as I did. Alec, thanks so much for taking the time to share your story with us today.
Hey, thank you. Great to be here. I'm seriously looking forward to this discussion. You know, the opportunity to follow on some of the fantastic guests you've had is it's an honor.
I was just mentioning how we got Mike Vickers coming up, and
yes,
I had to imagine you all had crossed paths, not just with the drone program, but at the agency. And yeah, it sounds like you guys have had some intertwined paths even since leaving the agency.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, we saw each other last year at a conference that we were both speaking at. And I am absolutely looking forward to reading his book coming out. There's a guy that goes back to the 80s and, you know, the first Afghanistan with the Russians and, you know, and the CIA mission there. And, you know, I think he's documented in Charlie Wilson's War as the guy playing, you know, two different chessboards at once. And I didn't know him back then, but yeah, that's him. Absolutely.
He's such a good guy, such a good guy. And the book is great. So I got the read ahead copy, and just like yours, I think that the kind of what's so good about it and your book is that it gives you just a little more inside baseball, like what actually goes on in these gigantic bureaucracies when we hear about CIA, but actually knowing what goes on and making decisions, especially with the other parts of the U.S. government and military, which yours digs into deeply.
Yeah,
I thought,
thanks.
I was hoping we could kick off, Alec, with how you and I got connected. I thought that might be a good way to do that because it was through a listener.
Yeah, it was through one of your listeners and a good friend of mine, Colin McCavitt, president of Indigo Industries, who I worked with a couple of times over the last couple of decades. And he's a great technologist, innovator, and we're working on some great DoD projects now, trying to bring new technologies into the current fights. So yeah, Colin's a good guy.
And it's
one of your bigger fans. So
it's not every day that I get a lead like this where somebody recommends, hey, you should have someone like Alec on. So
I just hate having to give him credit for it. That's the only part that sucks. So
that's what I love about the community. The that love relationship like that. Look, one of the things that stood out to me looking at your background that mirrored mine to some degree, not just the Army to agency side of things, but how you grew up overseas. I grew up, my father was a career political officer at state. So I lived in Zimbabwe, Pakistan, and Belgium. You also grew up overseas, and I was thinking this would be a great place to start out.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think my childhood really kind of planted those seeds for what it was going to be like living and working internationally. Although I obviously didn't recognize it at the time, but my dad was collecting information and publishing it for a different audience. But he was a journalist. So yeah, born in Austria, and then I was born in Austria. We moved to Germany, we moved to England, spent a couple years in the States, and then my preteen years, 10, 11, 12 were spent in Moscow, Russia, where I'm just a kid trying to do kid things, and I'm in school and trying to acclimate and learn the language, and yeah, and we did duck and cover drills to be prepared in case the Americans attacked. And I'm like, why would they attack? We're Americans, and so it was kind of this very young age awakening to not everybody's just on the same page and trying to do the right thing. So yeah, I watched my dad as a journalist, and it was years later. In fact, it was after I left the agency that I told him about my career there, and
Wow.
he was a little surprised to learn that I wasn't actually living my cover job. But yeah, that was wasn't the first time I lied to my parents, but it was a big one.
It was a big one.
It was a
Hey,
big one.
Alec, why did you decide to do that? And just for people who are listening, obviously, when you go into the agency, you can't always tell people what you're doing. Oftentimes, people will share with family, but some people decide not to for various reasons. What was your rationale there?
Well, you can appreciate this from having worked at the agency, but were we allowed to talk to the press? No. So, why should I? Both my dad and my stepmother at that point were journalists. My dad. So most of the time I was at the agency, he was working for. He had finished with ABC. He was at CNN, and covering the White House, covering the Pentagon, covering State Department.
Wow.
And my stepmother was the AP correspondent for the Pentagon. So I wasn't going to give them the inside source on the agency side, or even create the opportunity for somebody to question it. So yeah, you're right though. I mean, it's oftentimes left up to the individual as to what you share with family and when are the kids old enough, and obviously you share with your spouse, but yeah, for the parents, and that wasn't happening while I was working.
How hard was that for you to not share that
What, to
at the
keep a
time?
secret from my parents?
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
wasn't that hard. That was no heavy lift there.
And
But
just
he was, they were doing the same thing. They're collecting
yeah.
intelligence and reporting it. They're just reporting it, via their medium, either print or TV in their cases. And so I was doing the same job. I followed in my dad's footsteps, just a little bit to the side in a
Yeah.
different audience. But yeah.
Hey, talk about having to live your cover. I mean, for somebody who would know what you're talking about inside the Beltway, in the organizations, like reporting on some of those places, that
Yeah.
had to have been very challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And my dad, he was his army time was as a army intel guy, as a linguist. So yeah, he knew the deal. But
Oh man. How
yeah.
about if we go back to your time in Moscow, when you're there, how much did you notice about or notice around you the feelings toward Americans? Were you at the international school? I would assume. Was it an
I
American
was,
school?
I was, I
What
was.
was the sentiment there? What can you give us the years that you were there and what that was like at that age?
Yeah, so we were there 78 to 80. And I as journalists, they weren't really entitled to any of the embassy benefits, beyond any other Americans in there. But we actually had a better time with the Brits and the Canadians, who, their embassy communities were a little bit more welcoming. But I was just a kid doing kid things, trying to sneak around, start fires in the hallways, and normal kid things, and gotten a couple of fights with the Russian kids, but it was over ping pong balls or matchbooks or something like that. It wasn't we weren't settling big diplomacy issues in the schoolyard. But it was, I mean, living in we were living in Moscow. I definitely knew that there was tension. I'd hear the conversations that my parents were having, and we'd hear about it at school. But I was in the international school, and which I fared better than my sister. She got dropped into a Russian preschool and spoke no Russian, and she had a little bit harder time of it. But yeah, so I didn't really have any great insights on the tensions other than what I was hearing from my parents. But man, once I got home and doing high school and outside the Beltway and in Potomac, Maryland, I'm saying, oh my God, I was there during this, and yeah, now I understand what was going on in those early years. But
you kind of jokingly refer to yourself as not the best student, I guess, going up through high school.
yes.
I'm just wondering, do you attribute that to the moving? Did you enjoy living in those places, or is that what kind of contributed to maybe the less than stellar academic performance as you described it?
I was a late bloomer. I didn't mature academically early on, but I think as a kid I was jealous of like when we were someplace where kids had grown up together and really known each other their whole lives, and I'm like, I'm changing friends every 2 years. I mean, it wasn't dissimilar from from a PCS in the military or later on the agency side, but yeah, I was jealous of the kids that had their whole lives together and grew up, just with that depth of friendship. Whereas, conversely, they were jealous of me for having all these awesome international experiences. So it was just, it's a little bit of looking over the fence, seeing if the grass was greener on the other side. But, to me, I think, in Moscow in particular, I was not focused as being a young student there, and I think that just perpetuated itself through high school. And I got by okay. I got into college, but I opted to defer that. So I was mature enough to know I wasn't mature enough to
Yeah.
to go off to Penn State, straight out of high school.
Was there any inkling at that time when you were in high school that the agency might be in your future, or was it just, I'm going to go into the Army, this is the right route for me?
Yeah, I knew enough to know that there were some standards at the agency that I was probably not gonna hit with my academic performance. So yeah, so it was my senior year of high school. Dad and stepmother are working at the White House. 98% of my high school class went on straight to college. I was a little rebellious, nothing too crazy, but my civil disobedience was, I'm gonna not go to college and see how the parents react to that. And I enlisted. I got my dad to take me down to the recruiter at 17, and so that I could get in the delayed entry program. And after my dad watches this, I'm sure I'll have a healthy conversation about a couple of things, but we'll see if he agreed with my disobedience at that point or not. But yeah, Army was absolutely where I belonged. I needed that. I needed the structure. I needed the discipline. And like I said, I wasn't on a mature path to go straight to college. So it was awesome.
How'd you know that? Like, what was it that told you to go to the Army? Obviously, you said your old man had served.
Yeah. And I don't know that it was a conscious decision to follow in his footsteps. I used to get routinely asked, like, are you going to be a journalist like your dad? And I'm like, those are massive shoes to fill. I don't think I want to try and climb that hill. But yeah, I mean, I could definitely see, maybe on the subconscious side of, following his footsteps on the military side for sure. But, to me, it was, I needed the adventure. I needed some place to channel my energy. And, the Army recruiter who I actually recontacted just recently, Sergeant
Really?
Shelton. Yeah, he's up in Upper Peninsula, Michigan. And, he was a good dude. And, I know a lot of people had some less than stellar recruiter experiences, but he was awesome. And I repaid that to him because, like, right after I signed for delayed entry, I had his business card. I was allowed to tag along with my dad and my stepmother to a White House correspondence dinner for a
Wow.
Christmas party. I think it was one or the other, but Reagan.
It was
So
Reagan. Oh my God.
I'm in the receiving line, and when I got up to him, in fact, I got a picture here somewhere, but when I got up to him, shook his hand, and I handed him my recruiter's business card. I said, "I work for you now, sir, and here's the guy that signed me up." And
Ah,
he hand wrote a note to my recruiter, sent it to him, and it was pretty
wow.
cool.
That's super cool.
Yeah.
One of the things I would love to just touch on before we jump into your military time is the feeling. What was your impression of America growing up overseas? Because for me, it was this place I would visit every couple summers for a few weeks. What was it like for you before you came back for high
Yeah,
school?
pretty similar. I mean, we came back and we were in Philadelphia for I think a year and a half. 77, 76, 77, somewhere in there. But I'm like 7 years old at that point. And it was like, it was where my grandparents were. It was where the grass was green, and, you sat and you had picnics, and, you just appreciated the family and that time. And where, by comparison, when you're overseas, it's like, it's new people, it's new environments, it's foreign languages, it just wasn't familiar. But I don't think I really got that appreciation for home and for America until really in high school. When I'm, we've talked more about my immaturity than I'm comfortable with, but I, at that point in high school, I'm like, this is special. But I think it took really until that point that I really did see that.
Yeah, got it. And when you go into the army, you said that the recruiter story wasn't too rough, which is great to hear.
Yeah.
Um, did you have your mindset on, I want to go this MOS, I want to end up doing this type of work? What was that for you?
I don't know whether my recruiter was steering me towards, some slots he had to fill, but we started going through the options, and this to be so I was a 97 Bravo. I was a counterintelligence or special agent ultimately, but you start out as an apprentice basically, but so I'm like, well, that's pretty cool. I don't have to have a college degree, and I can carry a badge and do investigations. I'm like, that sounds pretty good. And it worked out great. Did basic at Leonard Wood, went to Fort Huachuca, went to Benning, and as I'm halfway through jump school, the notices come out. The informal notices says, yeah, you're going to be PCS to Germany, and I'm like, awesome. So what little free time I had, I'm like trying to read up on what I should expect in Germany. Then when I finally get my orders, they were to Korea, and
No.
and I went up to my TAC officer. I said, "But hang on, there must be a mistake. This ain't right." And he said, "Have a good time in Korea. You're out of here." And that was an adventure unto itself. But yeah, and I spent I did 4 years, and my goal was to get mature and get ready for college, and I did that. I did a couple of classes while I was enlisted, and then got out after 4 years, transitioned to the reserves, went to Penn State, which is where I had been accepted while in high school. But my mom was up in Allentown, and so getting up close to her was important, and going to Penn State. So I went there, and I was a awesome student at that point. I loved college. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to take every course I could, but yeah, so it was the right path. So rather than failing out of school, Army put me in a good spot. I went warrant while I was in the reserves,
Ah,
and
interesting.
and at at Penn State, I did a summer. One of my summers I spent down in Panama, working at Quarry Heights, working for my old battalion commander, General Harding, who was my battalion commander in Korea. Phenomenal guy. And then I got an internship my last year in college, and ran into General Hughes, who was my brigade commander at the time, and now he's the director at D.I.A. And
Jesus.
yeah, and I wound up I'm on the Hill, Senate Armed Services Committee, and working on the Seapower subcommittee as an Army guy, because that makes sense, right?
This is
And
while you're a warrant in the reserves,
yes,
Alec?
yes,
Okay.
yeah. So I go in, and Les Brownlee, he was the staff director for Senate Armed Services Committee under Strom Thurmond, and he said, "Hey Chief," he goes, "I'm assigning you to the Seapower subcommittee." I said, "Okay, sir, I am the Army guy," and he's like, "I know." So yes, sir. So I got to work with John McCain. I got to work with Trent Lott, Bob Dole, and by working with them, I was carrying their papers and preparing briefings and stuff like that. But the Scott O'Grady shoot down
Oh,
in the
yeah.
Balkans. So General Hughes shows up to testify for that, and he's like, "What are you doing here?" And I told him, I said, I'm here, and he's like, "Come work for me." And I said, "What do you got in mind?" He goes, "Well, let's get you commissioned first as a lieutenant." And I'm like, "I am completely content on the warrant officer path, so thank you." And then he says, "Well, come work for me at D.I.A." And I did. As soon as I graduated, I went in as an analyst doing counterterrorism analysis for D.I.A. And that's how I got into the intel field, outside my enlisted service.
I'm always jealous of the people who have somebody come and handpick you into this community. That's great that happened. Do you think, would you have found your way into the intel community some other way if that fortuitous kind of encounter didn't happen?
It's a good question, and I don't know. I would suspect not. The odds are so high. It's so hard. I hadn't set my sights on DIA. That wasn't necessarily my career goal. I probably would have gone back on active duty after graduating college, and this seemed like a good balance. I do the reserves and get some get my government service time.
Jeez. So you go in, and actually I do need to backtrack. I don't think I asked you, why did you reach out to your recruiter recently?
Oh, just I think either he might have found me on Facebook, or it was some publication from the book, something related to that. Either he looked for me or I looked for him. But yeah, so we've traded a couple of notes, and
That's really cool.
he's a solid guy.
All right. So you get into DIA. You mentioned kind of the committee that you had been working on. When he brings you into DIA, where do you start to kind of cut your teeth in the intel world there? And what year are we talking so we can give people some context?
So this is 96. And so we're right after Khobar Towers bombing. And we're a year and a half before the East Africa embassy bombings in
Can you
Kenya.
talk about the Khobar bombings just for a moment? We've never really covered them on here, and I think we often just start with 9/11 and move on. So I think it'd be great to just touch on that so people have that context of the terrorism environment you're starting out in.
Sure, sure. So, at this point, we've got a semi-permanent presence, throughout the Middle East, and in particular at this point, in Khobar and Saudi Arabia. Large barracks, truck bomb that stripped the face off of it, and a phenomenal amount of casualties, and a really, it was the first major incident since you go back to Lebanon, you go back to the Marine barracks and the embassy bombings there, and so it was kind of some renewed tactics on the part of our adversaries. But from as that investigation played out, there was hey, we need to start revisiting where are we at with these things like Hezbollah, Where are we at with Iranian sponsorship of, global terrorism? Where are we at with, I mean, we started again looking at Latin America. We started looking at the Far East, started looking at some of the European groups. I mean, all of these have certainly been tracked for, without any break in time. But in that 96, 97 timeframe, there was certainly an effort towards, keeping track of everybody's activities as best we could. And there was one guy, a colleague of mine, I'm not sure he'd want his name out, so I'm going to hold on it. But, he took me kind of under his wing, and he says, I'm going to teach you about terrorism facilities worldwide. He goes, we're agnostic to the group. We're looking at the infrastructure. And part of that look is for, what's the intel that we can gain from this? How can we support the community? How can we support policy? And in the event that somebody needs a target, how do we support the targeting effort? And I wound up working in parallel with him, and then taking over that account, covering all terrorism facilities worldwide. And at the point that we were looking at it, we were very focused on the Middle East and a little bit on Asia and a fair amount on Latin America, but we hadn't put any effort in Afghanistan. When we're looking at the Middle East, we're watching the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. We're seeing who's coming and going from Baalbek. We're seeing, what that pipeline of activity, Syria, Lebanon, look like. And there's this, this character, at that point that was very, relatively unknown, of Bin Laden. And he's sitting in that 96 timeframe. He's being kicked out of Syria, out of Sudan, and moved himself to Afghanistan. There must have been a trigger event in there. It certainly wasn't just me being in taking the initiative on it, but we started looking, what are those ungoverned or undergoverned environments where terrorism training can take place and fester. And Afghanistan was, that was the perfect petri dish at that point. So we put a lot into starting to understand that in that 97 timeframe.
And at the time, you're at D.I.A. You're still in the reserves. You're a civilian with D.I.A., Alec?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. And then just because drones become such an important part of your career, I know there's a lot more that goes into it, but I wonder if it's worth setting the context for what drones are doing at this time. I know in the book, like some of the first unarmed drones are looking at some of the facilities you're talking about.
So yeah, very good point. And honestly, when we get to talking about what we did with Predator, there was not a conscious decision to look back to this time, but really my foundation in drones and what they could do was really watching what the Israelis were doing in Lebanon and the innovation that they had. Our tendency, and I'm looking at the Apache behind you, but our tendency is to create these monster vehicles that are, just multi-millions of dollars. And obviously in a manned aircraft, that pilot is the cornerstone of that. But in an unmanned sense, the Israelis were very basic about it. It's like, we're going to monitor facilities or, and do our reconnaissance, do our target planning, so forth. And we're going to do it with drones because they didn't want to put manned aircraft over the Bekaa Valley. But the difference was they were willing to lose these drones. They'd put, tens of thousands of dollars into a drone. And if they lost it, they lost it. If it got shot down, it got shot down. But they were creating some intelligence from it that was well worth the expense in that scenario. And I'm like, what a phenomenal tool, where we're not dependent on satellites, and we're not dependent on human intelligence, and we're not dependent on signals intelligence, but we can get that, that full motion video. I was really jazzed about being able to see what they were doing with the drones. And then, at the same point, there's this experimental program with Predator as a advanced concept technology demonstration. It was a science project within Office of the Secretary of Defense, and Air Force was playing with it, and my co-author would take exception to me saying playing with it, but they were playing with Predator in the Balkans and trying to do some monitoring of activities and in the Balkans during that time, and weather was their biggest impediment, and they were figuring out the technology, but they had great success. It gave it enough maturity that a little bit later on, when we were looking for tools, it was a good one.
And that's make sure I get the name right. Colonel retired Mark Cooter.
Correct.
All right, got it. So yeah, your co-author, and I think that's so important with the book, how you kind of weave the two experiences that you have, firsthand experiences throughout this drone program.
Yeah.
You mentioned Bosnia, and that maybe it sounds like Mark was involved in that at the time. Were you part of that effort as well? Were you seeing that firsthand and how drones were being employed?
No, actually not at that point. I'm still deep into the terrorism infrastructure on a global basis. We're starting to map out the stuff in Afghanistan. I'm building a database on IntelLink that maybe somebody's looking at, maybe not, but it's there. I mean, and it's worth noting there are so many phenomenal intel analysts sitting in corners of various buildings, specializing in the most obscure things. I remember there was an analyst. Her sole mission was identifying power lines in like North Korea, and from imagery and just mind-numbing stuff. But when somebody needs to know about power lines in North Korea, they're there. Or the woman that was tracking everything having to do with Assad in Syria, and just saying, hey, someday somebody's going to have to know something about this character, and I'm going to be it. And she did. 10 years of expertise on it, and called to the big show when somebody needed to know it. So there's a lot of, and my lane was the terrorist facilities, and thankfully not telephone poles.
How interconnected were you with the other parts of the intel community at the time?
Yeah, so the liaison within the community was pretty good. We'd do the conferences, we'd share information. What we were seeing, we were pulling from SIGINT, we were pulling it from signals intelligence, human intelligence, imagery intelligence, to try to build this picture, to try to articulate, why is this place significant and how do we know about it? And the relationship between my then future employer CIA and D.I.A was functional. It wasn't we weren't interacting on a daily basis, but we were sharing information, and a lot of what we were databasing on the Defense Department side was based on the products being written and developed on the agency side.
You end up just given the name, working with Alec Station. Is that what it was with Scheuer and his crew pre 9/11?
Yeah, and that's where. So yeah, let me draw that for you. So East Africa embassy bombings happened. Kenya and Tanzania, both the embassies were hit there, and President Clinton's like, as the determination was made, for attribution, and I'm looking for targets. They were looking for infrastructure. So they come to this kid sitting there hammering out on terrorist infrastructure, and they're like, hey, what are some good targets for this Bin Laden guy that we can look at? And I'm like, I'm glad you asked. I got this nifty database that nobody looks at, and we started digging through it, and that was like my introduction to Scheuer and to Alec Station, which I thought was a really cool name for a station.
I gotta say,
maybe it was prescient on their part, but no, it was a kid of one of the early people in the station was named Alec. But anyway, so I'm interacting with the case officers and the analysts and the collections management folks, and we're comparing notes, and they're filling in gaps, and it was this great collaboration. But then we kept bumping up against this wall of, like, well, we can't tell you why we know that, or we can't tell you why, or we can't tell you exactly when or where. And I'm like, come on, just let me see where you're getting this. Help me understand and qualify this intelligence.
This is the agency, the CIA side, kind of saying, "Hey,
while
we'll
I'm still
collaborate."
sitting on the I'm still sitting on the D.I.A side, and they're like, "Yeah, you can come up and meet with us, but don't get too close to our systems and don't ask too many questions." And so, long story short, we develop a target list. We wound up striking targets in Afghanistan, some training camps, and it's mud huts. We're throwing $1 million cruise missiles, 2 per target, because one is none. So we're throwing $2 million worth of Tomahawk cruise missiles against a mud hut, times a lot of mud huts, and then targets in Sudan as well. Partly going back to them providing safe haven for Bin Laden, and then some other reasons. But we're not feeling great about the outcome or the effect of that. We're not taking Bin Laden or Al-Qaida off the battlefield for sure. But we are working through targets, and it was technically it was a success, but there were some consequences to some sources as a result of that. And my boss, then the J2, Admiral Wilson, and Admiral Fry, who was the J3 for the Joint Staff, worked some kind of deal with Director Tennant, or likely some of his deputies, and said, "Hey, we need to get deeper in. Let us send somebody up to CIA, detail them to you, put them on the box, polygraph, and do whatever you want." And
lucky you.
And put them on your side of the fence, so that we understand better, how these sources are collecting in this particular case. So I got detailed to Alec Station, under Counterterrorism Center. So I show up as the D.I.A detailee, go through the whole process, which was interesting, and I'm almost over it, but it was I was happy to be there, and I was happy to do it. Right, starting out as an intel guy in the Army, to say that just less than 10 years later, you're sitting at CIA, inside of an operational station, a virtual one, but an operational station, working through all the sources and methods. It was phenomenal. I proved myself over time. I had Cofer Black, who was the chief of the Counterterrorism Center. We were out and we were going down the escalator in Vegas. I remember it vividly, but we took him out there for look at some technology, and he's like, "Have you ever thought about coming to work for me?" And I'm like, "Well, what'd you have in mind?" Because I didn't want to seem too eager, but and he goes, "You got everything we want, but I'm not convinced you have a college degree, and that's a requirement." I said, "I got one of those." And he's like, "What's your degree in?" And he's like, "Never mind. It doesn't matter. You're good. Let's go." So I was direct hire.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
You got hand picked into D.I.A, and then Cofer Black brought you. And for people listening, I mean, Cofer Black is a legend at the agency, a legend.
Yeah. And cool. It was on the escalator at the Monte Carlo Hotel in Vegas.
As it should be.
That's how it happens, right?
How could you share just a little bit? So Mike Schroyer, I think his first name was Mike. He was a professor of mine. So I've read his books. I've listened to him talk in grad school. And the way he describes it, which I think is fair, but I just love to get your take on it, is there was as you said, you were in the Counterterrorism Center, but for those who have ever been inside the building, the Counterterrorism Center pre and post 9/11 is a very different place. Yeah. He really couches it in terms of they saw what was coming, but couldn't get a lot of buy-in for other people to see the terrorist threat that they believed was barreling towards us. Yeah. Did you get that impression as well? I mean, you were at D.I.A, maybe seeing something a little bit different.
Yeah, no. So first on Mike, phenomenal guy, and maybe superseded by this point, but at the time, the smartest man on Al-Qaida, on Islamic extremism. And if Mike had a flaw, it was his message was often lost in the delivery. He was so passionate.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great assessment.
And his books, I don't know, they're phenomenal. Still worth the read for anybody academically inclined. Yeah, he was beating the drum early and often, and the system at that point was somewhat risk averse. We hadn't had an incident since East Africa. This is still before the bombing of the Cole.
Mm-hmm.
We're aggressively within our lane, aggressively working against the Bin Laden and the Al-Qaida target set in Afghanistan, that was once we cleared me getting into the agency, it was really, I was on a small team with some absolutely patriotic Americans, some former military, some career agency who were just passionate about this, and very like-minded people to Mike. And living it every day. It was the where's Waldo, trying to figure out where he was in a tactical sense, but it was also trying to get insights into the organization. What were the plans and intentions? My piece was more on the physical, tactical side of where is he, and less on the organizational piece. But and the thing that often gets called out is the lack of intelligence sharing within the community, and frankly, my being there was part of that solution from the DoD perspective, to be able to go back down to the Pentagon, which I had to do routinely, and characterize without giving up the sources and methods. But it sounds stupid, but to be the person that was from the Pentagon, to go back and say, yeah, this information is credible based on what I'm seeing of the stuff that they're not sharing with the community, the sources and methods. And sometimes that was enough. But this is not to say that there weren't equally passionate people to Mike on the DoD side. I mean, the J31 for the Joint Staff, General John Mayer at that point, he wanted that meeting. I think it was weekly. It might've been twice a week. I'm going down and I'm briefing him. And then his replacement, if you ever cross paths with a guy named General Honore, who you see him at the disasters, the hurricanes. He's the Cajun, orchestrating the National Guard responses, but he prided himself. I think he came out of Fort Hood before he went to Joint Staff. He's there as I think a 1-star. And he would routinely summon the CIA people to come down and try to explain why we couldn't find Bin Laden. He's like, give me a target. Give me a target. He goes, I'm not from around here. I'm not from DC. I'm going to lock all you effers in a room until you give me a target. Which was frightening to say the least, but he was awesome. But so the passion was there. DoD wanted targets. There was enough of a sense that there was something brewing, that there was something growing, that the community was looking for, what is it, and how do we prepare, how do we preempt it, and we didn't have it.
Is the Cole incident worth talking about from where you were sitting at the time, just given its proximity to 9/11? I feel it was so close, looking back now, on the heels of it.
Yeah.
Maybe if we talk the Cole and then the time in between to 9/11, were you still in that station operating there?
I was. In fact, we were pretty deep into our program at that point. So October of 2000. And in fact, Colonel Cooter, who was Major Cooter at the time, was at Ramstein when the bodies were flown into Ramstein from Yemen. So for those not familiar, the Cole, the USS Cole, was doing a port visit in Yemen. And then these are largely diplomacy visits, more than logistics visits, and showing a presence, and the attack was from a small vessel, and it was catastrophic for the Cole, that then had to be put on another ship to bring it back, and clearly for the soldiers, sailors that were killed. But Yeah, we were we were already operating over Afghanistan. At that point, we were tracking, key Al-Qaeda infrastructure in Afghanistan. Mark was at Ramstein, which was our forward location, where we were doing our analysis and we were flying via satellite from Ramstein. And Mark sees, more hearses than he cared to count, and pulled over, showed his respects, went back to the office, got on the phone to me, and asked, what the fuck are we doing? How did this happen, and what are we going to do about it? So
Wow.
yeah, that was in the middle.
Jeez.
So, and that, so that's 10 months before, or 11 months before 9/11. And it's 2 months after we started operating over Afghanistan.
So maybe, I know you had to go through a very painful process to get a lot of this cleared. So without giving people too much secret sauce of what's in the book, could you just speak to, as you say, like you're trying to build the picture in Afghanistan for people who don't know what that looks like? What does that kind of tactically day to day look like? What are you looking for? What are you able to build up at that time?
Yeah. So, and this is the hard part for everybody, myself included, to think after, now we've spent, 20 years in Afghanistan. Yeah, by at this point in 2000, there's zero Americans on the ground
Yeah.
in Afghanistan. There's zero pieces of technology on the ground from an intelligence collection perspective in Afghanistan. And we've got a couple of sources. CIA had a couple of sources. D.I.A had, one or two sources on the ground, but these are Afghans. And, we're talking to somebody whose cousins, sisters, grocery salesman or vegetable guy or road guy sees something, and it gets reported, 3, 4 people up. And we're just thirsting for this because there was such a gap. There was such a deficit in intelligence coming out of Afghanistan. And, so that's the human side of it. From the imagery side, we're getting single image satellite shots pretty frequently, but we're trying to then extrapolate. Oh, well, there's 3 vehicles at this suspect training camp. What does that mean compared to last week when there was 2 vehicles or 7 vehicles or whatever? And then on the signals intelligence piece, keep in mind during the Taliban, like there's not a lot of cell phones in 2000, let alone in 2000 in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of radio comms. You can't, as a private citizen in Afghanistan, you're not allowed to listen to music. So what's that transistor radio going to do you? You're not talking to people on handheld radios. It's just cameras. Like we try to get cameras in. Why would you have a camera? You're not allowed to take pictures of anything. So it was to me, it was like this, how much harder could this get? We can't get there on the ground. We can't overfly it because, and this became very relevant, as we're like, what else can we do? We can't overfly it because it's landlocked. And, if you look around the neighborhood of Afghanistan, Iran, unlikely to help us. Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Pakistan. We had some relationships in the neighborhood, but we didn't have any really close allies. And, we can debate the Pakistanis and their role with Bin Laden for a long time, but suffice it to say, we weren't going to trust them with anything too sensitive at that point. So as we're sitting there just doing the best with what we got, the President Clinton takes a briefing from the CIA director, George Tenet, about our activities against Bin Laden in Afghanistan. And the feedback was that it didn't go really well. And that was December of 99. In January of 2000, we get a memo from Sandy Berger, National Security Advisor, written by a guy named Richard Clark, who's the counterterrorism czar under Sandy Berger for President Clinton. And it was a top secret, all kinds of code word memo at the time that has thankfully now been, we're allowed to talk about it. But it says, dissatisfied with your progress in Afghanistan, CIA, you have some unique authorities that you've been given, and you've got the best access, the best of the bad access on the ground. So it came to CIA, to the ADCI for collections, a guy named Charlie Allen, who anybody that's worked in the intelligence community knows as absolute legend. And then it went to Admiral Fry, the J3 at the Joint Staff, saying, hey, Pentagon, you guys have the big checkbook and all the technologies. You all need to put your stuff together and collaborate and do something in Afghanistan. And it did lay out, it was a couple of pages, and it laid out some conditions. So Charlie Allen sends it to Cofer Black. Cofer Black sends it to Rich Blee, who was running the Bin Laden station, Alec Station at that point. Rich Blee takes me with him because he's like, hey, you come from the Pentagon, right? You know what these Pentagon people do. You know how they act, right? You know your way around the Pentagon. I'm like, yes, sir. So he's like, come with me to this meeting. And, the result of that meeting was, we're going to have to answer this memo. We're going to have to talk to the Pentagon to do it. Bierbauer, you're our action officer for this. And then on the Pentagon side, there was a guy named Dr. Hariar Kabayan in the J39, and a phenomenal scientist, absolute patriot. I think he slept in the Pentagon. He never left. Anyway, he's tagged from the Joint Staff side. So they pick a scientist on the DoD side. CIA picks this, this new, I think it was a GS-13 at the time, who knew how to get to the Pentagon, threw us together as the action officers, and said, answer this memo or give us the response that we need to provide for this memo. Well, I lay out all the conditions in the book, but the important one, the kicker at the end of this was, develop actionable intelligence. And that was defined as putting U.S. eyes on target, and target being Bin Laden, and do it in 9 months, and ready, go. So coincidentally or not coincidentally, depending how you want to look at it, that 9 months was election season at the end of 2000, or in November 2000. Anyway, so I'm like, all right, I got to answer this memo. What are my resources? Well, you don't have any. You don't have any people. You don't have any budget. You don't really have any authority. You got your computer and whatever you can find in there. But you can go to the Pentagon and do whatever you want, because those are your people. So I find in OSD, I find one of the greatest Americans, this guy, Alex Lovett, who is in charge of emerging technologies, advanced systems and concepts, which is where Predator was. And then Air Force, we talked to Snake Clark. I thought his first name was Snake for like the first 6 months I knew him. It's actually John, I think. Anyway, he's head of Air Force Innovation. And Hariar Kabayan put all these people together. He's like, all right, let's form a group. We'll get this team. He goes, bring your people down from CIA. And I brought my boss and a couple other technologists from our S&T side. And we sat and hammered out a list of conditions and, what was reasonable given the timeline. And we said, okay, it's got to be at least prototype or better. And how are we going to get this U.S. eyes on target? And, we gravitated towards this. Well, if we can't reasonably get a manned aircraft over Afghanistan to give us that technical U.S. eyes on target, can we get an unmanned? And I'm like, this is, I hope my career is not hinging on this. This sounds like some risky stuff. So anyway, so we cobbled together a couple of courses of action, some ground sensors that we were going to air deploy, that we were going to have our few sources kind of move into Afghanistan. We had a pretty good plan, a couple of courses of action and how they were all going to inter support each other. But the cornerstone of this was a drone, an unmanned aircraft. And so this guy, Alex Lovett, and his boss, Dr. Perkins, Chuck Perkins, they're like, you need to go out and look at this thing and see what it's like. So I go out to Rancho Bernardo, General Atomics. I'm still waiting for the thank you, but because they've sold a few Predators since then. But we sit down the head of General Atomics Aeronautical Systems, a guy named Admiral. Can't think of it. I'll think of it. But anyway, we sit down with the Admiral, and it was the cheesy, because this was inside of a special access program at this point, top secret, whatever. But I said, I can't tell you where I'm from. I can't tell you what we're here to do, but we want to use your aircraft to go penetrate another country's sovereign airspace and look for one dude. And he's like, okay, so you're from the CIA and you're looking for Bin Laden in Afghanistan. He's like, stop with the games. And I'm like, I'm just doing my job. Anyway, he says, I think it's a terrible idea. And I'm like, what? Why? And he's like, when you fail, I will never sell another Predator. And he goes, we're just a prototype. We're just getting this thing off the ground.
Wow.
So he was seriously like, you're just going to tarnish my my brand, my reputation, my aircraft. Anyway, so I leave there. We walk out, and I look at Alex, and I'm like, what are we going to do? And he's like, don't worry about it. The Air Force has a couple of these, and we'll just go take theirs. And that's when we went to Snake Clark, and he's like, absolutely. Because it's not hard. I'm not, I mean, it's a good story on the General Atomic side. And they obviously have done very well, and they get great credit. There are amazing people there. And we wound up taking some of those people, contracting them, and sending them forward for us. But yeah, that was the start of the program. And to answer your question of where we were with what do you collect and how are you doing it, we were really in a tough spot.
Jeez. Just out of curiosity, if the Predator was still 10 years off, right? Like you wouldn't get it until 2010. What would the next course of action have been to geolocate and take out Bin Laden?
Yeah, good one. Good question. Tom Cassidy, that was the Admiral's name at GA. Anyway, yeah, if we hadn't had that, and I'll take this one off the table in a second, but there was the baby brother of the Predator was a Nat 750, which the agency had one of, maybe more than one, but there was one that was in the inventory as an experimental platform, but it was very limited on range. It was limited on altitude, limited on dwell. It would not fit the geography of what we were trying to do in Afghanistan. And that became a real sticking point later on. But so taking the drones off the table, we had a telescope, a autonomous telescope that we had commissioned the Navy at Pax River they had a phenomenal lab in this under NAVAIR called Special Surveillance Programs, run by a guy named Chao Shen, who was like, I gave him the requirement, and it was how I learned not to write a bad requirement, because I wrote a shitty one for this. But I said, we need something that our sources can take and put on a mountaintop and look down on this one camp, Durunta, just outside of Jalalabad, where we thought that was a real nexus for some of the training and some of the testing activities that they were doing. So, NAVAIR builds this telescope. I told them it had to be man portable. And what they gave me was men portable. It took about 19 people to carry this thing in its various components and then put it together. But they gave us what we needed so that from 40 kilometers at 13,000 feet, with solar power, wind power, marine batteries,
no way,
a gimbal telescope. It was amazing. Anyway, that was our fallback position, was to infiltrate this thing into the hills up above Durunta and Jalalabad, and try to do we needed to get that, that profile. We weren't going to get a positive ID with that image quality, but we were going to get the the security profile on Bin Laden there, and pair that with our human and hope that would be good enough for a decision.
So I think now might be a good time to jump to 9/11. I am just personally curious where you were at when this happened. Like, what room in the building, if at all, were you in? But also, I was struck with the book When We Took Our First Shot with an Armed Drone. I just didn't realize how early on it was. So the fact that you're having these discussions with General Atomics and these courses of action to the time we actually put one down range is pretty incredible. So if you could take us to 9/11 and set the context for this.
Yeah. And I don't think anybody that's more than 22 years old can't tell you exactly where they were 9/11. And I was in Cofer Black's office, and lesser known event, but the only guy that was really holding the resistance together in Afghanistan, Ahmad Shah Massoud, was killed 2 days before 9/11. And so we were discussing that in Cofer's office, and he was Cofer's a big guy, and he's an intimidating guy, and he was not getting the answers he wanted. It was already a bad day, about to get phenomenally worse for him, but and the rest of us. But yeah, so I come out of Cofer's office, and Libby, who was his gatekeeper and in charge of the front office, said you might want to look at the TV. And so it was just after the first plane had hit, and video was coming in on that. So Rich Blee, who was in the meeting with me, came out. Hal, one of my colleagues, came out, and Cofer came out, and we're standing there watching it. And Hal and I both, so we had taken over for our program. We had taken over the Global Response Center for Counterterrorism Center, not the big ops center for CIA, but CTC's response center for a major terrorist incident, which thankfully sits mothballed most of the time, doing some other minor communications programs. But anyway, we had taken it over, but we had. It's exactly what you would imagine it was. It was big TVs everywhere, and a command center type setup. And Hal and I looked at each other, and he's like, "Let's get back up to our office," which Cofer's office was in the new headquarters building. Ours was in the old. So by the time we got upstairs, was right before the second plane hit, and we were already working phones and our computers trying to see what was going on and who knew what. And the second plane hit, and it was shortly after that message came out across everybody's computer that the headquarters was being evacuated. Pentagon had already been hit, and there was the fourth plane that nobody knew where it was going. So the message came out, and to evacuate everybody except for the operations and the Global Response Center. And I'm like, well, we're sitting in the Global Response Center. We don't technically own it, but yeah, we're staying anyway. So, and then everybody got to it wasn't a very formal relocation site, not like it is now, but it was the continuity for the organization had never been tested. It had never really been written. There was kind of some informals. I won't go into the details, but suffice it to say, the director was there, his whole leadership team from the seventh floor, and they're relegated to watching a TV broadcast as their only intel source. So Rich Blee calls me, and he's like, "Hey, what's going on?" He goes, "The director's standing on a desk, and he's really pissed off. We need to start getting some answers." And we were, as helpless as everybody else at that point, definitely knocked off our feet, and trying to figure it out. But it was, despite all of our great resources and big pipes and great comms, there wasn't a lot for the first couple hours. But the Air Force and what they had provided us over the previous 5 or 6 months to put the Predator program together, we had some pretty good friends. And I mentioned Snake Clark earlier, but Snake calls me and he's like, "Hey, Pentagon's hit, but I'm in my office. What do you need?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm not really in a position to obligate CIA resources, but he's like, no, just tell me what you need." And I said, "Well, we really need at this point the aircraft that we had flown over the preceding couple of months was we're back in California getting some modifications made, including the weaponization piece. And so all of our people were outside of our forward location, and all of our assets were out. All of our aircraft were out. Both of our aircraft, not all of them. We only had two. We're outside of Afghanistan, back in the States. So I told Snake, I said, "Well, I can't. I don't have the authority to task you with this, but it'd be really cool if somebody could move the airplanes and our people. And I think I know where we're going and what we need to do." And he's like, "Well, no aircraft are allowed to fly, but I know where to get the exemption for that." And he had a C-17 out in California loaded with Predators. There's an interesting story. I think it's in the book about a rental car that may have gotten put on the aircraft just by accident or convenience. I'm not sure which. And some of the crew, including some GA guys. And he's like, where do you need them? And I said, "Well, if you could swing by Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, pick up some Hellfires, and then stop in DC so we could throw some more guys on the airplane, maybe take off the rental car. And then we're going forward." And that was all, that was on the 11th of September. I mean, that was still that day that stuff started moving, and by the 12th, we've got an aircraft in DC cross-loading people and equipment and heading back in theater. And by, I think it was the 16th or 17th, we're flying. So we've made it back to our mothballed operating area, put the Predators together. We weren't flying armed because we didn't have the authority on it yet, but we were back in Afghanistan and looking for targets. So within 5-6 days.
When you were watching on the TV at that moment, a lot of the people I've talked to, as you mentioned, where you were at. And a lot of these guys, even the tier 1 guys, were like, we didn't know who it was, but we knew we were gearing up. We'd go and get our gear. Was it just like you knew exactly this is AQ at the time?
I think, it wasn't a great leap. There were two choices in the first couple of minutes, and then it became one pretty quickly, but it was either Bin Laden or Hezbollah. And, there wasn't anybody else with the operational maturity, with the organizational architecture to put something together of that magnitude. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't my call, but, I mean, I think it may have, Cofer probably said it before the second airplane hit, and he's like, "This is no accident. This is terrorism, and we know who it is." So yeah, it was, well, we knew we were heading somewhere in theater, regardless, but yeah, we weren't second guessing that. We let the forensics catch up to us, but in the meantime, we wanted to go back anyway. We were a couple, it's not that we were able to cobble everything together on the 11th and 12th of September. I mean, we were close to redeploying anyway. And if I could, I just want to step back to, we started flying in September of 2000 from a undisclosed airfield. It's hard to say clandestine airfield. It's kind of an oxymoron how you hide an airfield, but we penetrated sovereign airspace, put it over Afghanistan. A lot of firsts to get there, and developed full motion video exploitation. Certainly from an agency sense, from a national sense, the Air Force had done some of it in the Balkans. We built our team, and we found Bin Laden. I think it was the 18th of September of 2000. We're looking at him.
Unarmed, right? Just to
we are unarmed.
Unarmed.
Yeah, that's a pretty important distinction. But yeah, we were unarmed, but the plan was in place, right? We had 2 submarines off the coast of Pakistan. cruise missiles, grid coordinates, pre-programmed, because we were pretty sure that in the unlikely event we found him, it would be at one of the known locations. And in fact, that was it. So we'd taken as much out of that kill chain timeline as we could. And, you know, and finding him in real time, 9 months, plus or minus a couple of weeks, we're sitting there with technical US eyes on target, pinpointed on a grid, you know, right now. And you know, and couldn't close the kill chain on that. So, you know, we flew some more, we collect some more intel, and then we shut down in early November, I think, and moved everything back to the States with the full intentions of going back. But in that, after we could not close that kill chain, when we found Bin Laden on, I think it was mission 5 or mission 8, we, you know, that's where the kind of never mind, we'll do it ourselves title for the book really got locked in. There were a couple of milestones before that, but that was a big one. And, you know, the concept of weaponizing it, you know, got put on the table. So that's what we were doing during the winter months when we couldn't fly.
And so to clarify there, that book title, Never Mind, We'll Do It Ourselves, was we had eyes on, couldn't kind of complete the kill chain. It was less about approvals, more about the capability to deliver when you saw it.
You had a 2-hour time of flight for those cruise missiles.
Yeah.
And the question came back, really the only question we got was, you know, where's it going to be in 2 hours? And the, you know, the for whatever reason, you know, that risk was not sufficient to pull the trigger.
And you end up finding
it's hindsight too, right? So it's easy to say post 9/11, it's easy to say you coulda, shoulda, woulda, you know, to anybody in a decision-making position at that point. But yeah, at the time it didn't happen.
You end up finding yourself in Afghanistan more than once post 9/11. Would you have imagined that on September 10th that you would have spent time in that country?
No, in fact, I dreamt of it just because I'd stared at it so much. And, you know, the prospect of being there in this, you know, truly denied environment. But yeah, I was very fortunate. I was supposed to be transitioning to a PCS assignment, and my replacement was identified. I wound up staying until, you know, for the first couple months of the war, I stayed, you know, working Predator operations from headquarters. And then I got the opportunity to go and be a base chief on the Pakistan border near Asadabad. And what a phenomenal experience. I mean, very surreal. Everybody in the early years were, you know, you had to volunteer. Some people were asked to volunteer. Some people were encouraged to volunteer. I absolutely, you know, wanted to be there, wanted to contribute. You know, it was not a time where the agency was deep on the paramilitary side. It was not a time where it was deep on tactically experienced. And admittedly, my Army time was, I had some of the fundamentals, but, I listened to some of the interviews you do, and I'm like, these are some rock stars that, you know, I just want to go do the best I can. So the timing was, at that point, it was, you show up in Kabul, and you find out where you're going from there. And the gap when I stepped off the airplane was, well, we got this one base down in the desert, or we got this one up in the mountains. We'll send you up to the mountains. And, I did a, high five on the LZ with the guy I was replacing. And then I started listening to everything that, my paramilitary folks on base and the folks that we were co-located with. I'm like, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go? And the predecessor I had there was a little less inclined to go out and do things. And I'm like, it is the circumstances for why we're here are horrible. The fact that we're here, we are some of the few people that have something we can do about this. And, there's millions of people around the world who are helpless to, to put together this response. We got to do it. And sitting behind this wall, we took over an old Russian fortress. Sitting behind the wall here is not what we need to be doing. So, we had all cast of characters from, the 82nd through some tier 1 folks there, and SFODA. And, you tell me where you want to go. We had to provide input on it. We did, nightly meetings, doing plans for the next 24 hours. And it was surreal to think about, and the rare opportunity you'd sit and pause and think about it. But it was awesome.
What were your, first of all, what year is this? 03 that we're talking? 02.
Yeah.
So what month there?
So this would have been May of 02.
What are your marching orders as you?
That's a great question. There weren't a lot of rules, and I don't say that to offer that it was chaotic and carefree and do what you want, but it was somewhat chaotic. And there was your litmus test was more your personal moral and ethical guide than it was a set of orders. My boss was the chief of station in Kabul. I had responsibility for the base and my AO and the people assigned there. And we were reacting to the intelligence that we were getting. And I asked, where's the Pakistan border? And they said, you'll know it when you find it. So I'm like, I remember reading something during my disruptive youth about the Duran line. Let's look this, ask the question back to headquarters, can we use the Duran line as the border? Because it was kind of undefined. So when we ran into Pakistanis, we knew we had gone too far, and we pulled back a little bit.
How advantageous was your experience watching that country from above for so long now that you're there?
Yeah, I think it was significant. And, in a very personal sense, I wanted to go and visit the training camps. I wanted to get ground truth. I wanted to validate the assumptions that we had made. And there was a place called Pashad that was close to where I was. And we went, and put together the con-op and went out there and validate, okay, this is what this was. And, it wasn't storage. It was, billeting or whatever. That was very valuable. And then getting down to Durunta, where we were, positioned to look at it from 40 kilometers away, getting on the ground there and looking at that place and from the ground perspective was, it made me a better intel officer after that. And I encouraged everybody that we had out there to really capture those lessons learned, because, prior to that, like on my way over, I'm reading what was the book? The Bear Went Over the Mountain, I think, talking about.
I've read that too.
Yep. Russian ambush sites, and I'm like, well, I don't know where I'm going yet in Afghanistan, but I'm going to pay attention to these. And so that was my pre-operational planning, was reading The Bear Went Over the Mountain. And then when I found out that I was going up to Asadabad, I focused in and I went and I looked at some of those ambush sites too, just to get a better understanding for the tactics.
Did it give you, having seen this place from above for so long, did it give you a better, risk tolerance for getting outside the wire? You mentioned like your predecessor was less inclined to get outside. You were a bit more forward leaning there. Was it because you had studied for so long and you're like, hey, look, there are bad places here, but we can move fairly freely in certain areas?
I think there was a component of that. I think there was a component that, not everybody out here is bad. We got to sort the Taliban from Al-Qaida, from the guy that's trying to just feed his family, and factor in those pieces. But, I think it probably also, there was an element of my mischievous youth in that, mom and dad aren't here and chief of station's really far away.
Pretty far away.
He's tied up on some other shit. So we were really encouraged to press out, develop sources, develop intel, find contact, That was really it. And frankly, it was, I had spent enough time talking to our Afghan sources that I felt like I had a little bit of an advantage there. And when we had a source that developed some pretty compelling pieces of the intel puzzle on where a high value target might be. And it was in my area. And in fact, I sent back I sent the cable back, and I wound up getting a call from Bagram, from JSOC saying, "Hey, we want you to bring your source. We'll send you a helicopter and bring him to Bagram. We want to talk to him." And I'm like, "That's really not the way we do business, but yeah, what time does the helicopter get here? Let's do this." And so I take my source, my interpreter, and myself. We fly to Bagram. He gets locked in a sea lane container for a while. The commanding general is like, he's like, "Hey," he goes, "you got a compelling intel source here. I want to look him in the eye, just him and me." And I'm like, "Well, you can take it. Might want to take the interpreter too." And he's like, "All right, I'll take the interpreter." So 2 folding chairs, in the sea lane container for, I don't know, 3 minutes. And he comes back out. He's like, "All right, I believe him. Let's do this." And then, the full of every air asset in country was committed to this. And the rock drill was a phenomenal learning experience for me. The brief, the commanding general says to his J2, who was at the time, I think, Colonel Keller, wound up being General Keller, and Captain Winters was J3, wound up being Admiral Winters. He says, CG says to Keller, he's like, "All right, we're going to break this up. You take your intel people back into your shop, and I want to know if this is a ruse or a lure." And I'm thinking, okay. So Keller's like, "Hey, you're with me." So we go back and he gets out the butcher block paper and he writes ruse and lure. And he's like, "All right, somebody get me Webster's and look up the book definition of ruse and lure."
What did
And
he
I'm
mean by
thinking,
that, Alec? What's the intent behind that question?
make sure we weren't getting pulled into something as a trap. Make sure this wasn't us getting suckered into a bad situation. So the question was fair. I think the J2 took it a little too literally. But yeah, so we got out the book definition. We talked through it. We realized it was probably neither of those. So he reported that back. Did the rock drill, and we went that night. Like I said, every air asset in country, and it wound up being a dry hole. There were some people that got off the objective out of a cave when we were going in, and they were monitored by Predator. Our comms were not complete. We didn't get the word that they came out and went over the hill. To this day, we really don't know. We had some intel a couple years ago that was pretty compelling, but suffice it to say, it was a very comprehensive program to get in there, but yeah. So, and again, this was 2002. This was 2002.
What was the feeling like leading a base at that point in your career, especially at the front end of this war?
Yeah, it was awesome. The responsibility was daunting, and I knew that I was surrounded by professionals, that I was on their turf. This was, it was superficial to me that it was an agency run base, and that I had that type of influence and responsibility. But I took my role as enabling the units that we had there with the intel picture and the latitude to go do what they needed to do. And it wasn't always that way. That was a Sadabad. I was new to it. I listened intently to everybody that was there. The Ranger company commander was a captain, phenomenal guy, who he just wanted his guys outside the wire. The tier 1 guys that were there, we had Navy at that point. Same thing. The ODA was there, was from third group. then switched out for 20th Group. Totally, completely different story. But all those guys wanted to go do their jobs, and we had a fairly tough piece of terrain to move in up in the mountains on the border. My second posting was then the next year. I had a mobile team, joint team, small element, and again, I'm saying, like, am I the guy that should be doing this? But we were on the south side of Shahi Kot, running from like Ghazni, Gardes, Sharan over to Shkin, and we had 4 vehicles. There were maybe 9 of us with all the attachments, and then we had 12 local guards that I borrowed from one of the local governors, and our security was just being unpredictable and moving every 2-3 days. We'd commandeer a compound, set up a defensive perimeter, go out, do some meetings, test the local environment, not stay more than 72 hours, break down, do it again. So you're getting like 24 hours of productive ops for every 72 hours of movement and activity. But we tripped what we wanted. We disrupted the local environment, and we got some good tipper information. And to your point on that question of me, my role, my responsibility, my chain of command had a different risk tolerance than the tier 1 guys that were with us. And it wasn't always, they weren't always on the same page. I remember one instance where, we set up a traffic control point, really just trying to be in the right area at the right time, waiting for the tipper. We get the tipper. I call the piece of information that was time sensitive and allowing us to be really close to our target. I called my boss, and he's like, go forward, do great things. And Navy guy talked to his boss, and he's like, stand down, you're not doing this. And so, so I went over to him. Obviously, I am far less capable in that environment than he was, and I'm like, hey, I'm just gonna go do this thing, and you just hang out here. I'll be back a little bit. And he's like, yeah, bullshit, we're not doing that. But I said, well, but if I need help, you'll come help me, right? And he goes, yes, I'll come help. But we wound up putting it together. We wound up getting all of us on, and it was one of the sketchiest things. Was we had to get confirmation on this compound. We had a piece of signals intelligence saying our guy was here. AHVT, not DHVT, but so the task force that was driving down and showing up at 2:00 in the morning said, before we get there, we need to know composition on the door of this compound. So I took my one of the Afghan guards, and none of us had showered in quite a while, or our personal hygiene was not great. Theirs was a little worse. And I took his clothes, and one of my military counterparts did the same thing. And, the 2 of us took off with a local vehicle to get, one look at this compound. And we hit it so fast going through there. And I'm like, I saw that there's a second gate inside, but I can't tell you what it was. I can't tell you if it was metal, wood, whatever. So I learned where details matter, because so we get out of that, we had that one pass, we get back, we make comms, and we're like, it's a really big door and unknown composition, unknown type. And they said, all right, fine, good enough. So we rallied with them in a riverbed, and they told us to lead the convoy, and we had a Predator overhead. And this was me being on the ground side of this capability that I helped put together, which was phenomenal. So I'm on my satellite phone, hanging out the window, trying to, like, hey, tell us if there's anything in front of us. Cause there's 14 vehicles and gun trucks behind me. We really want to get this right. And like I said, details matter. So they're like, hey, you're coming up to a fork in the river. You want to go left. And so we went left. Well, we went my left, not their left. They were looking at it from the other direction. So we get 3 vehicles into this, and they're like, oh, hang on, wrong direction. My left, your left. So now we got, 14 gun trucks doing 3-point turns in a riverbed, trying to back up. And and all filmed, and I knew a room full of people watching it back at headquarters and some other places. But anyway, so we get up on the objective, and I find myself as like number 4 outside this gate, and this explosion rocked my world when they breached the gate, and my eggs were scrambled. I didn't know which way it was up. I was completely ineffective at that point, and I stayed outside, which is where I belong. But later on, I'm like, hey, what happened with the door? And they're like, some jackass said unknown type, unknown composition over the radio. So we went for overmatch on that door. And I'm like, what does that mean? And they're like, 2 haversacks. I'm like, what's a haversack? Anyway, it was a mess. But
this is great.
Achieved the objective, got our guy there. But yeah, details.
I mean,
matter.
The fact that this isn't like you got a source doing all this. This is you observing, going in with the hit team. I assume when you pull the guy out that you're probably also somewhere near the room doing the interrogation as well.
There was no interrogation to be had, but yes, I was in the area, and but nobody told, like I said, there weren't a lot of rules early days, and I didn't want to be the guy, providing the intel and not being there, and nobody told me not to be there, and it seemed like the right thing at the time.
Can you tell me, and we'll cut this out if it's the wrong direction, but I remember reading about Mike Spann's death in the outset of the war, and I know it was busy, chaotic, a lot going on. Do you remember when that happened? Like what the sentiment was like inside the agency when you were so close to the problem set?
Yeah, it was devastating. And I went to the funeral, and it was
I was there too, Alec. I was a college student. I just showed up on my own.
I think I heard you say that before on one of your podcasts. Yeah, I felt it was important to be there along with hundreds of others. But yeah, the sentiment in the agency was losing one of our own and the first of the war, and it was pretty devastating. I mean, it's not that it wasn't real before then, but it was like, holy shit, this is real, and bad shit can happen, and certainly did. It was highly impactful. I don't know that it tightened up some policies, but I don't know that I don't feel like we got any more risk averse at that point.
That's where I was wondering if you felt like being a base chief, if it influenced that at all.
That did not, but there was an officer killed at my base just after I left, at the Sadabad base, and I went back and we didn't call it a death investigation, we called it an inquiry, fact finding. Because I had been the last chief there, I went back to do that fact finding, and I knew the people, I knew the circumstances, but one of the things that came back out of that is like, well, why did he not have a vest on? Officer didn't have a vest on, and it was common practice. One, we didn't have enough vests for everybody early on. We didn't have enough Kevlars, which I was thankful for because I didn't want to wear that damn thing, but I'm thinking maybe I don't want to be the only guy not wearing a helmet, but we just didn't have them. We were swapping guns on landing zones or handing them off at station on the way in, way out. We were deficient on gear. We definitely didn't. Before I left for that first deployment, they gave me like $2,000 or $3,000 and said, go to REI and get anything you might need. So that was my kit. Was me going to REI in Northern Virginia and spending like a madman, which $3,000 wasn't a lot, but it went pretty far back then, and but I didn't know if I was going to desert or mountains. But anyway, so
I'd love to see the revenue spike for that store post 9/11. Like that first year, they probably decimated the rest of the country.
They probably had the shopping list there, and they're like, oh, you look like you need one of these. And, well, yeah, no, it was, but on that investigation, very seriously, it was hard because, they were like, well, when you were chief there, what was your policy on wearing vests? And I'm like, we would go out for patrols and oftentimes be combat ineffective by the time we got to the objective. Not just us, but the Rangers that we were with, would routinely, you'd get 200 yards from the vehicles on this patrol, and somebody would make a radio call asking to ground vests and Kevlars, and the captain would he'd be like, it got to the point where it was funny because it happened every single time. But then you got to peel off 2-3 people to stay with the gear. But the environmental conditions were hard. Altitude was pretty extreme. So it was not a policy to have a vest on at all times outside the wire. And it may or may not have, saved his life, but but there was a lot of criticism then that's when we started getting rules, some very important, some very necessary, some a little more goofy, but that was an important transition point. And that was, just after a couple months after Mike's.
Yeah. As you look back on a lot of these, and I know it was funny as we were preparing, one of the things that you mentioned was you did several tours to Afghanistan, and you were kind of committed to never going back each time you wrapped one of those up. As you look back at those times, what was some of the most courageous things that you saw? Because you were there early when a lot of us would have killed to be there.
Yeah. No, and to be clear from our earlier, it's going back to Afghanistan. I never shied away from. And it was, it was hard because I had my oldest daughter was born a month before 9/11, but so I missed a lot of those those early milestones, which I know your listeners are of the same or worse conditions for having missed holidays and birthdays and stuff like that. But that part was that constant tension and getting home, not getting home. But that was I knew that was a career defining opportunity and one I didn't want to miss out on. I did a I'll call it outside a theater of war, but much more dangerous than even being in Afghanistan those early days. Actually just a couple of years ago. And that one, in fact, I told my wife, I said, if I ever tell you I want to go back to that place, stop me, shoot me, do whatever it takes. It was very different. It was an expeditionary base, and we had a significant lack of proper resource in there, but the mission was awesome. But so I did the first, came back, a couple months go by, I get the call saying, hey, are you willing to? And I'm like, yep, let's go. So I go, and my wife's like, where are you going? And I'm like, she's like, you told me. I said, I know, I'm gonna do it. I get back the second time, and she's like, let me guess. And I'm like, yes, do not let me do that again. Just tell me to say no. A couple months go by. So I did 3 of those and improved the circumstances each time. But we went from a very dynamic environment without a lot of support, ours or anybody else in the neighborhood. It was really, like I said, good mission, but pretty rough. That was tough. So to your question on the most courageous that I've seen, experienced, I gotta say, and you've covered this with some other guests, but Roberts Ridge, Operation Anaconda. So at that point I was at headquarters, and it's our asset overhead. We weren't even tasked to Operation Anaconda. We were prosecuting some intel targets and transiting the area, and had to get cleared into the area because so routinely when you're just mind-numbingly flying through the air at 100 knots and looking for something to stay awake, the sensor operators, if they saw a helicopter, would go, we'll follow the helicopter, see what they're up to, or, oh, there goes an airplane. Or,
oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Or there's, a couple of goats out in the field. I mean, they just find something to look at, but they saw the helicopter get hit. And, with the RPG, and it took, obviously a chaotic environment, getting cleared in on that. But, we were still, on the air tasking order, there's the secret level coalition. These are the aircraft. And then there's the blacked out section on the bottom for other aircraft that aren't getting declared. And we were in that line. And so we had to tell people who we were first and then get cleared in. And so as that played out, and if you're not familiar with the story, read about it, because it's an important one for a number of reasons. And you've had some phenomenal guests on telling the story, as either the pilots involved or others participating. But anyway, so we felt like we needed to do as much as we could. My Air Force counterpart, Colonel Cooter, Major Cooter at time, calls me. He's like, "Here's what's going on." I'm like, "I know, I'm watching it." And he's like, "Do we have your permission to?" And I'm like, you go do what you need to do. We're staying out of this. This is a military operation. Don't slow things down by coming back to me. They get overhead. They ask to establish comms with the guys on the ground. They get permission, and we were operating in the clear for our we weren't supposed to communicate off the aircraft, but we had a radio on the aircraft. We were using it as a poor man's SIGINT platform. So anyway, our pilot, says, exchange call signs, and says, "Hey, you don't know me. I don't know you, but I'm in Virginia. Well, actually, there's an airplane over your head. It's a drone. There's no pilot on board. I'm the pilot. I'm in Virginia. Anyway, I've got 2 Hellfires, if I can get to my point, and if I can be of any use to you, just let me know what you need." And he's like, "I don't have time for this." And, figuratively hangs up the call. But anyway, a little time goes by and he's like, "Hey, this is me. So about those Hellfires.
Yeah.
Tell me again where you are." "Well, I'm in Virginia, about 7,000 miles away, but the aircraft's sitting right over top of you, and I'm pretty comfortable I can put that Hellfire wherever you need it." And he's like, "You're going to pull the trigger on a Hellfire from 7,000 miles away, danger close on me? I don't think so." And he goes, "I'll tell you what." He goes, "I'm going to give you a target down the hill. I'm going to walk you onto this bush. You hit the bush, and then I'll have confidence." And so he says, so Mark calls me. He's like, "Hey, they want us to shoot $100,000 bullet at a tree just to prove that we're not going to hit them by mistake." And I'm like, "I don't know that I've got the authority for that, but yeah, go for it." I did not have weapons release authority, but I'm like, yeah. So they hit the tree, and he's like, "All right, hit the bunker to my front," and hit the bunker, which for that point in time suppressed the Taliban, that they couldn't. They were in that hardened bunker. Anyway, so my only concern was, we only got 2. We'll use one as a demonstration for you if you want, but yeah. And then that pilot, our pilot, when that Predator was due to come off station because it was out of fuel, he got out of his Sealand container in Virginia, ran around to the next Sealand container, climbed in the cockpit, air quotes, of the other Predator that was then transiting in. And so that pilot, we felt it was important. They had built rapport. We felt it was important to keep that same pilot, the same voice.
How unique, now it's probably an entire procedure and operation how you do it, but it's almost like a startup trying to break in.
It is, but they're still arguing over, can you do close air support? Can you do CAS with a drone? But in fact, so we're out of Hellfires, but the next one came in, I think, at Hellfires. We shot those. We lased for every service that was flying.
Wow.
We lased for the Marines, but the P codes we couldn't sync up the laser codes to their pod. So, but we lased for Army, Air Force, and Navy, and then we lased for a French Mirage, and they didn't ask. We were still a classified system. We just shared codes, and they never asked where the laser was coming from. So, and then just suppressed throughout the night. yeah, until the next QRF could get in.
You know, for people listening, obviously this is near and dear to my heart because this aircraft that I have behind me, and those who are listening can't see it, but we got this blueprint behind me of the Apache. I mean, we had a laser on there, and as you talk about lasing, like to send a Hellfire downrange, you laze it with you put a laser designated target basically on where you're shooting, and then the Hellfire seeks that out. When you're out of Hellfires, you can laze for somebody else so their Hellfire can go, or their munition can track the same laser to the target. And if you have situational awareness, you might be the only one who knows where everything is on the battle space, and you can really be a force multiplier. That's incredible.
Yeah. So that, the courage there was for the guys on the ground. Certainly, that it's a hard story, but it's our piece of it was try to give as much support and frankly comfort too, through some hard hours a day as they waited to get off that mountain. But yeah, credit goes to them. But we developed those tactics on the fly in that environment, and I argue it is close air support. So
yeah, and maybe you just described the answer to this question I wanted to ask you, which was there a point in time as the armed drone capabilities evolved where you were part of a strike and you were like, this is exactly what we had in mind. This is why we have this capability that you got to see or be a part of?
Yeah, it almost happened the first night of the war, but and we detail that pretty well in the book. But we did shoot the first night of the war, first weapon off of a drone in conflict. That I got the first one off for the ones I could see, the first one off a test was sitting behind me.
Well, I don't know if I can see it. Can you? Is there a?
So I picked this one. I picked off the desert floor out in California.
That's awesome.
After it bounced off of a tank during a test shot, and I took it. I carried it home. It was before TSA. I carried it home in my carry-on. But anyway, yeah.
That's the casing from a Hellfire.
It is AGM 114. Yeah. Anyway, first night of the war, we were fully prepared. Our tasking was to go after Mullah Omar, the spiritual head of the Taliban at that point. And we didn't wind up shooting Omar. We did wind up shooting his vehicles and his security detail. And it's worth reading, but it's that it was impactful, no pun intended, but it was impactful because one, we proved the full chain. And it was like, if we had this a year ago, what if we had this a year prior in 2000 instead of 2001? But we were pretty sure it was going to work, but we weren't 100%. And it did. We got the desired effect of forcing Omar out of where he was, but couldn't put together the subsequent shots. To me, one of the most impactful pieces of that, though, is that the CIA is doing this from headquarters. The CIA is doing this in collaboration with detailed Air Force and contractors and staff officers forward. It's requiring George Tenet, the director of CIA, to be on the phone with General Franks, Commander CENTCOM, in order to put all this together and execute those shots. So that broke the code on how to do it. But killing Mohammed Atef, the military lead for Al-Qaeda in Kabul, downtown, just the building that he was in, although the neighbors were likely unhappy with it, but killing Atef was probably the biggest target that we got in those early years. I also, the legacy of this goes on to, Soleimani,
recently,
and many in between. So I think it's a useful tool. I think it's a tool that requires a high degree of responsibility, and it is powerful because you're preventing people from being in harm's way.
Yeah.
But with great power comes great responsibility too. So
I feel like it almost requires less responsibility though, because you don't have the human factor. You don't have the Grady shoot down.
yeah.
Nobody has to go in and get them. Obviously, you lose the technology if something goes down, but you lose that in a manned aircraft too. And you've got a possibly a more stable aircraft that doesn't have the same number of G's on it when it's going in for a shot.
I agree with that. I agree with, you're able to go places that you're not going to send other systems, other capabilities. Your intel's got to be good, and your targeting has got to be good. You can't lessen those thresholds because it's easier. It doesn't make it better because you got to put people in harm's way to get there. So, we have good, healthy debates. Some of the stuff that we work on now are focused on, the artificial intelligence aspects and
Yeah.
how much power do you give to the machine? And that warrants a debate. If everybody's on the same page with that, we're doing something wrong. That warrants a good, healthy debate. But from a technology perspective, the target recognition's there, the ability to laze and engage targets is there. You can push a lot of that capability forward on the aircraft.
Okay. So I feel like this is a good time to start wrapping up here, Alec. One of the things that I did want to ask is you were mentioning this expeditionary effort that you were a part of. You went there a few times and you even told your significant other, don't let me go back there. And you did. Why'd you keep going back?
I I I felt like I still had something to do, to give, to contribute. Um, I'm not I'm not the best intel officer. I'm not the most aggressive case officer, but I felt like, if I was being asked and if I was being afforded the opportunity to be, there's a huge machine of people, for every, you may know the metrics, I don't, but for every case officer out forward doing something, how many hundreds of people are behind them in building that intel puzzle, doing the analysis, doing the collections management, doing the support functions. So I felt an obligation to do everything I could, and do my part. There's a little bit of the adrenaline piece, there's a little bit of the adventure piece, but it's if we can, as bad as that particular environment was, if we can deal with it there rather than having it come home and dealing with it in another 9/11 or similar, I don't want to sit back and say I didn't want, I wouldn't want in hindsight to say I didn't go back because it was uncomfortable, or because it was dangerous, or because it was austere, whatever. So yeah, I don't know. I felt like it was my part to do.
And I'm not sure of this one. I don't know if when you retired, like, was it hard for you to hang it up? Or did you come to a point where I've given enough, like my family's taken enough pain from what I'm doing? Like, was that a factor in hanging it up for you?
I think the family piece, the support was there, the tolerance was there. For me, it was, I'm sitting the place I really can't mention where, but
Yeah.
one I didn't want to go back to. I'm sitting there on that last deployment, and I'm looking around at the team, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm the old guy. I'm the old guy. I'm the one that has to try and keep up. I'm the one that they're going to be looking back at saying, is grandpa going to make it? It was, it was, it was rough, but yeah, I'm looking around. And I'm like, a couple of people there were, preschool during 9/11.
Amazing.
absolute awesome officers, contractors, support. We had a physician's assistant with us that might have been a year or two older than me, but he was the PA. He could hang back a little bit. But it was. I think I just hit that point of realizing it's a younger person's environment. And now I can't do that piece, or I don't feel like I'm responsibly the right person to do that. So I'm focused on the technology aspects.
Yeah.
And so when Predator came about and we started putting that together, I never said I'm not an engineer. You've already heard about my early years. There was nothing in there that painted me as the smart technology guy. But I found myself, working with these innovative technologies, and now, I'm interfacing and trying to support through those functions. I'm working on current versions of a lot of these systems and trying to give the current warfighters the best possible technologies to keep them safe and do their job.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the things that so many of us are probably jealous of or envious, that you're still a part of that community and delivering support to the warfighter. And maybe just as we wrap up here, what was the genesis behind starting that company or being a part of this company for you?
Well, I didn't deal well with authority, so going to work for somebody else wasn't going to be constructive for me. I'd had too much autonomy throughout my career, so the only way to succeed in the private sector was going to be to do it myself too. So my business partner and I put together BlackRock strategy, and we've got commercial contracts helping people across the globe, risk management type stuff. And we love those, and we're passionate about supporting them and keeping them safe in a corporate perspective rather than a government side. The technology pieces we do are really cool. I had an investor call a couple hours ago, talking through, hey, what do you think about this tool, this widget? Is this something we want to invest in? And the fact that somebody's values the perspective on that and where they're going to park their money, that's a lot of responsibility too. And to be able to do both, enable development of a new technology that we as a government need, and to help get investor funding and to do that, that's 2 for 1.
That's great. I bet you've had your share of discussions on AI over the past couple months. Can't even imagine. All right. The last 2 questions that I try to ask everybody, Alec. One is there anything that you carried with you when you went on these deployments that had sentimental value, something that somebody gave you that you just wanted to have on you or nearby?
I can't think of anything in particular. I always had a flag. It wasn't always the same flag, but the first flag I brought back from that first deployment in Afghanistan, I gave to my dad, and then I acquired other ones along the way. But
wait, what did you tell your dad since he didn't know what you were doing?
Well, I told him. I mean, he knew I was working in a diplomatic role, but he didn't know where exactly. He didn't know I was out at the bases, but back at the embassy. So yeah. So there was always a flag, and and I was pretty sensitive to, after going through SEER school. I was pretty sensitive to, I don't want to have to deal with this, should things go sideways. So.
When did you go to SEER with which agency, if you could say? If not, no problem.
I did the Fairchild Air Force when I was in Korea. Yeah.
Oh, so not only did you not go to Germany, you went to Korea and got SEER school.
My first sergeant thought I had issues with his authority, so he gave it to me as punishment. But frankly, it was one of the better schools I ever went to.
That's great.
Yeah.
I feel bad that I missed that story. All right. And then last one, you spent a lot of time away from family, as you mentioned. I mean, we're coming up on Father's Day this weekend. It's something I'm mindful of, like how many I've missed. And thankful to just be around family. But as you look back on all the time you spent gone and away, whether it was in an office, locked there for hours, running an op or downrange in harm's way, would you go back and do it again?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I've got 4 daughters, 2 stepsons, a loving wife that's always been supportive. Although I'm starting to question when she let me go back on those two trips. But that aside, maybe I'll dig into that one later. But yeah, no, I phenomenal support and tolerance, patience for that. I would not do anything different.
Love it. Well, all right. So people, like, we just scratched the surface here. Never mind, we'll do it ourselves. It is an awesome inside look at how, to some degree, how the sausage is made, like with what became the drone program from its infancy, nascent stages, to where we are today. So highly recommend that. Also, if you just like the Tom Clancy side of things, like, you get it with this. You get it from the intel side, you get it from the military with the Air Force and what they were pushing for technology. So it's a pretty special read. So I would recommend that to people. And I'm just so thankful for your time, Alec. I know you're running a company. You got enough stuff to do. So thank you for taking a couple hours with us.
No, thank you again. And thanks to your listeners for putting the time into listening to this. I know that's a gift that you don't get back. And I appreciate that. And just on the book, there was a third, Michael Marks, who took what Mark Cooter and I would have produced as a very dry academic textbook, and he gave it life. He really did. I mean, it's and he was absolutely passionate about interviewing everybody he could get his hands on. We tell it from a first person, alternating between Mark and I, but Michael gave this story life, and yeah, there's some high moments and there's some low moments in there, but yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks again.
He's no stranger to writing books like this, so like, he does it justice, I guess I should say.
Yeah, he does. He's awesome.
All right, thank you so much, Alec. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that combat story. That one definitely brought back some memories just from my time at the agency and watching on at a lot of these events as the drone program picked up. Haven't ever really talked about it, but I interviewed at General Atomics in this stint between the Army and the agency, and interviewed all the way up through the CEO, but didn't end up getting the job. And I think that's one of those moments that I'm glad it didn't work out, because I would not have had that same chance to go to the agency. But at the time, it stung and really created a big incentive for me to get my acting gear to get to the agency. All right, so a couple listener comments here. One I chose just because Alec and I talked quite a bit about the burden on the family, what that means. Benjamin Walker said this on a recent episode. He said, "Spent 5 of the last 7 years without my son talking to me, even though he followed my footsteps into the military. 13 deployments thinking he was the rubber ball, 10 of which I was his only parent. Yeah, I definitely make up that family time if I had to do it over again. Making up for it now with my grandsons. Thanks for sharing. Let it go." What he was suggesting, kicks this comment off by saying, listen till the end of this episode. And I think that's true for a lot of these. One of the big regrets we all carry with us, myself included, is not having time with the family. Because you're downrange, you're getting a couple extra practice rounds in when you can, in a simulator, on a range, planning in an office, whatever it is, just to be better and put yourself in a better position and make sure your soldiers come back. But you give up a lot of time with family. Particularly aware of that as we just recorded this prior to Father's Day. So thanks for leaving that comment, Benjamin. Then we had a couple other good ones I wanted to read out here. These are from the Eric Neal episode. One says, "Excellent episode," and this is from Bob Light. A subscriber, by the way, so thank you for that, and this is on YouTube. It says, "Excellent episode. Eric is centered, has a basic load of common sense, and is the model quiet professional. Kudos to Ryan for letting him tell his story. Press on, the both of you." And I just love that. Eric caught me off guard. I didn't know what to expect. I hate saying this. I feel like he's this young guy now. He's in his mid-30s. Here I am in my 40s, and he was in a lot of fighting from 2010 to 2014. And I was just so impressed with him and his outlook and where he is now. So I'm glad other people saw it. And then we had Renegade Arms, aka Eric, had a couple good comments on this same episode with Eric Neal. Eric, of course, 3rd Special Forces Group, Green Beret. And Eric says, "One of my biggest regrets in my 20 years is not enough photos and not marking down or remembering certain dates." And Eric Neal did a great job of this, which is where I think this comment comes from. And he was in 2010 to 2014. And one of the comments I left back there on YouTube was basically, that's a regret of mine that I, number one, didn't keep a journal when I was downrange like some of the other people did, and that we didn't have fancy iPhones back in the day. So the pictures that we got to bring back just aren't quite the same. Eric's got some great ones that we were able to include. So if you are listening to this and don't watch it on YouTube, there's some great pictures of Eric and some of the other Green Berets he served with downrange that are worth looking at. This same subscriber, Renegade Arms, aka Eric, also mentioned talking about the extortion accident. What he said is true, that sometimes it doesn't matter how good you are, the enemy gets lucky. And yeah, I was just talking about this recently. We filmed a really cool episode. Not sure if it'll air by the time you listen to this. Maybe it will, with Scott Intake Cartvet and two other pilots who helped make the movie Top Gun Maverick. But one of the things we talked about was specific to aviation, but it's true with this comment, which is sometimes you just get unlucky. You do everything you can to put yourself in the best position possible. But as we like to say, the enemy gets a vote, and sometimes you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Extortion 17 is a great example of that. And I'm glad you brought it up, Eric. And those are the comments that we have for today. Just wanted to say thank you so much for everybody for listening and sticking it out through the end here. We got some good ones coming up. I hope we can make it work with a couple new areas we're trying to explore. One is a cool video we're pulling together of me flying with Intake in the back of a jet. It's crazy times. It's been a while since I smelled that much jet fuel, so I'm excited to see what y'all think. Hopefully we get something exciting out of it, and it's a little bit different for those who watch on YouTube. So thanks y'all for everything you do to keep us going, motivating me with these comments.